In Texas, there's about 10.5 million homes and businesses and meters, and a grand total of about 30,000 people were taking service under that structure. So it was a very, 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 very small number of people that got those outsized electricity bills. But they kind of, I don't think they had the imagination for how bad it could possibly be, but they kind of knew they were signing up for some volatility, right? So people don't really pay attention here as well. There's definitely a failure of imagination on the part of the planning cycle here of how cold can it get. It was historically, unbelievably historically cold.
That was right from the middle of this week's episode, where we discussed the Texas grid crisis of 2021, renewable energy in the US, and a lot more. Hello and a warm welcome to yet another episode on the Mission Shunya podcast. Well, the word warm reminds me of a different topic as I record this episode. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, in the latest report released earlier this past week, that is in August 2021, clearly concludes that the planet is warming at a faster pace and we could exceed the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit in the next decades unless there are immediate and rapid reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Well, as a regular listener, you probably have heard this before on an earlier episode, and in fact, you would have also listened to the leaders who are acting on this through various projects and solutions around the world. In case if this happens to be the first time you're tuning in, please check the playlist on any platform and you will find interesting conversations around the zero carbon transition, which is exactly what Mission Shunya is all about. 60 plus episodes of this recording, so do give it a try, let me know what you think. And yes, I will write a commentary around the latest IPCC report on the blog soon. That is missionshunya.com. Now on to this week's feature segment. Reforms in the electricity sector have been one of the success stories globally, at least to an extent. Countries which have followed a textbook approach of deregulation have been successfully reaping benefits in terms of having an efficient, independent system across generation, transmission, and distribution of electricity. US is one of the countries that has a robust system in place post-deregulation, and today's guest is going to share the story of how the US got here over the years. And most importantly, how his company empowers consumers to make better decisions when it comes to purchasing electricity. So our guest for this episode is...
My name is Jesson Bradshaw, and I'm the CEO here at Energy Ogre. And our business is focused on helping consumers. We help consumers in the retail electricity space make good decisions and assess different offers that they have available in the marketplace by trying to make it as easy as possible for them to take advantage of this deregulated market here.
So as an expert in electric utility services, give us a brief background about how you got involved with the grid services and what's your journey been setting up companies in this space?
It's been an awesome ride. It's been a lot of fun. To be honest with you, I think like a lot of people, when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do when I grew up or as an adult, I didn't have a good idea, and I was fortunate enough to fall into the power space, electricity, and at the time that I was coming out of college. It was right place at the right time. So here in the U.S., at the federal level, they deregulated the wholesale markets in the mid 1990s, and I found this small company that was just getting started in this space. They were trading natural gas, which had been opened and deregulated here for a number of years. And so I was really, super fortunate to be absolutely at the right place at the right time, and was able to get into the very beginning of the kind of the new world, at least in the United States and in North America, with the way that the whole infrastructure was in the process of deregulating. So one of the nice things about being involved at the beginning. And I think you'll see a lot of that in all different parts of the world as they, are on different stages of development. When you're there at the beginning, you kind of see all of it. You do a little bit of everything. It may be, not quite as sophisticated as it gets to after 20 years. But the positive news is when you start at the beginning, you get a really good overview and a very good base, a broad base of understanding of, a number of these different parts and pieces. So it's, really, really super fortunate. And, that gave me the opportunity to understand how the generation business works and understood how the transmission distribution business works. Even here in Texas, we introduced retail competition in the early 2000s. And so had a chance to be involved with that as well. So really pretty fortunate that I've been able to, work and be involved with the different places that I was able to, from the very beginning of my career.
That's a nice little story about your career and the work that you've done in this space. Now, you did mention about deregulation. Deregulation is a big subject altogether because US has been a pioneer in that, and other countries in Europe and India of late. India was a little late to the party, but nevertheless got that process started. But although how efficient is the deregulation, it's a debate in itself. But from your viewpoint, you did mention that Texas has the supplier competition, retail competition. Do you think or do you believe that deregulation has helped in getting the modern grid services better?
Yeah, there is absolutely zero question about that, at least in the markets here in the US that are really and truly open to retail competition. It's not even, I know people like to have the debate in some of these places, and but it's not even remotely close to a question. What happens in a vertically integrated structure, and this is what we saw, this has been the case, look, electricity is not any different than the experience we had in the United States. Some of them are very easy for people to see and understand, and other ones, around electricity and power are harder to see. But here in the U.S., when I was a kid, they had just deregulated the airline business. And so, it used to be when I was really young, that it was extremely expensive to fly, cross country. People put on their Sunday bests and they would get on a plane, and it was a huge, big event. And it was really something that you had to be, somewhat wealthy in order. It was a big expense. It was an expensive mode of travel, and the airline business deregulated, and it allowed innovation. We've got a company here. We've got these low cost airlines, Southwest Airlines and some of the other major carriers have done those things where it's really democratized travel, and it's made it where, it's for better or for worse. Some people may not like the fact that there's a lot more airplanes in the air, but it certainly made it far more accessible and made it far less expensive for, the average person here, trying to go cross country to see family or travel. So we see that. We don't really think about it because most people that are, young people here don't really understand what the regulated airline business looked like. They don't even remember we used to have regulated telecommunications here as well. So it used to be that AT&T was the long distance carrier. And if you were calling, long distance to somebody, it was unbelievably expensive. And so now we have all these, we deregulated at the telecommunications level. And I mean, telecom itself it's not even commoditized. We don't even think about it. We use, our smartphones with, gigs of data and things of that nature. Just that was an impossibility in the vertically integrated regulated structure that we had before. In energy here, we had the natural gas business that was, vertically integrated as well. And it got broken up. And so what happens is, here you gotta unbundle the wholesale market first and create a robust, competitive wholesale market. And then the retail side is a kind of a hand in glove thing that works here. So the deregulation at the wholesale level in the US has been I can go into it for as far as you want to go, but there's the efficiency of operations on the actual generation side is just orders of magnitude greater than it was in the vertically integrated space. So those utilities still deliver power on a vertically integrated basis, but in almost all parts of the United States, the generation of electricity is done on a coordinated basis, and it's really done where the most cost-effective units run before the next more expensive one. And that's just been a humongous savings from a cost and energy efficiency perspective. It's really hard to even articulate how big of a change that's been here.
That leads me to my next question on that, because as you said, there has been a significant change, but that has also put a lot of assets off the line. So a lot of assets are stranded. I think US as a market also sees an increased amount of transmission assets that are stranded in one place, but you have transmission assets that are being built in the other areas, like other territories where renewable energy is being built. So what's your thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the facts are here that, to get most states here, even going back to the opening of the market here in Texas, and this was true in California and a number of the other larger markets, as part of the opening process or part of just the overall energy policy, a number of these states have what they call a renewable portfolio standard. So they have set certain thresholds of mandated renewable energy that they want in the portfolio. And that's been going back over, 20, 30 years. And so obviously the technology and the efficiency of some of these renewable resources, what gets built today doesn't look like, it's just not even comparable to what got built 20 years ago.
Correct.
But, the reality here is that there's a humongous, and there has been a humongous federal subsidy incenting people to build, renewable, particularly in Texas, and wind, because we have a lot of land here. You can put wind farms in remote parts of the state, and you can lease the land on an inexpensive basis from the landowners. And there's a very large, and there has been historically a very large federal subsidy to put that kind of generation in the ground versus traditional stuff. So the federal government has had its thumb on the scale, and as a result of that, it has stranded certain other kinds of assets because it's not really a competitive environment.
Correct.
But that's a policy goal. That's what the powers that be have decided that they want to see here and in other parts of the United States. And so because of that, when you have a market distortion that's created by government, then you're gonna, whether it's a good distortion or not, it's debatable, but when you do that, then you end up getting things like here for us in Texas, a lot of the wind capacity was built in a very geographically dense area. It's all the wind, or a very large proportion of the wind, is geographically in the same area. And so we have a lot of concentration of that generation in areas that's really far away from the population centers. And what we got there was, not surprisingly, a situation where we were generating way too much wind power and couldn't get any of that power to the population centers. So a big investment was made in transmission infrastructure to debottleneck that power being able to make its way to people that actually needed energy.
It was an inevitable decision to make.
Yeah, it was a ripple. It was a ripple that started from the incentives that are there by policy or by tax incentives, and so those are exactly the kinds of activities that those policies were designed to drive, and it was, as you said, an inevitable outcome of that being put in place.
The ripple that was started by the government and the government policies kind of started the entire transition towards renewable energy. But now at this point, who drives decarbonization? Where do you think the major driver is? Is everyone figured out that it is more cheap to build renewable energy plants compared to the other alternatives that are available?
Yeah, so I think that to me, the answer is that it's a technology race. I think the answer is it's a technology race,
Okay.
but it's also it's also going to be a function of the reliability that the end consumers are willing to accept, and how actively involved. So, people talk about this, and I think in think tanks and policy centers, you will see people say it's entirely doable for us to move to a completely carbon-free generation system, grid, and infrastructure. And I think that that's extremely optimistic with today's technology if we're trying to provide the same kinds of reliable service, at least here that I'm familiar with. It's very difficult to do that with renewable or intermittent resources when we don't have an appropriate storage scheme that you can put in place. So it's completely doable if people change their consumption behavior in response to the availability of energy, or if we can store it a little bit. But here, when people say that, in Texas, when it's, for us, I'm not sure what the crossover is. I'm sure some of your listeners will chuckle like, oh, that's not hot. But, 38 to 40 degrees for us is, maybe 100 degrees with 100% relative humidity. People don't like to not be able to run their air conditioners.
Correct.
So, because the population here is pretty spoiled of always having electricity work, like they just don't think about it, that introducing some of these sacrifices that you need to introduce in order to have that work with a completely decarbonized infrastructure, I'm not sure they understand or are really at this point willing to do that. And so obviously it's a graduation of that whole scale. But that's what I see here. In terms of other parts of the world, I know we had talked about this briefly when we first spoke. But there's a real neat opportunity in a lot of emerging markets around the world to not be shackled with a lot of the legacy infrastructure. And
Correct.
And so it's something that I think about a lot. In traveling 20 years ago, I was fortunate enough. I traveled in lots of parts of Asia, and one of the things that was the most striking to me was when I would ask someone in Indonesia about their phones and landlines, and everyone's like, "Man, we don't do that. We have cell phones." And so it was kind of cool because if you look at what the amount of investment and maintenance and upkeep that we have in the U.S., we started with copper lines, these landlines that went house to house, these big exchanges, and
Correct.
I can look out my window here and see this huge building that is no longer used, that AT&T used to use for switchgear, that's probably done by something smaller than a laptop in today's world, that all these other parts of the world got to skip. They got to skip some of those things, and don't have to have poles and power lines or telephone poles and everything all over the place. They built a better technology. They were able to skip two rungs down the ladder. And for here, a lot of our stuff is still kind of tied to the legacy infrastructure. If someone has built it and they have money invested in it, they want to figure out how to keep people paying for it. So there's I think a lot of that, especially in that, and that's why I said I think some of this is going to be a technology race, because if in some of the developing parts of the world and some of the emerging parts of the world, they become very, I can see a scenario where we have a new emergent technology that puts, some kind of a battery storage in, the end user side that's cost effective. Let's say a saltwater battery, or, we think of lithium ion, but think of some other kind of a battery technology that allows us to source some of our energy. We might, in that house, we might have, solar there that we top up our own batteries. We might have some grid power that we get a hold of, but we kind of know that every day at 5 o'clock, it gets a little bit tighter on the system. And so we kind of swap over to our batteries. And
Correct.
that's just, the way we live. And that's the way we've, always done it. And we don't expect anything different. And so there's a more, no one's spoiled to begin with. There's a willingness to kind of work within, what's reasonable and what's available, as opposed to always demanding more and more and more. So I think it's pretty exciting, to be honest with you. I absolutely expect a lot of the innovation to come. It's that see a need, feel a need kind of situation that I expect to see a lot of innovation, come out of some of these parts of the world that will probably lead the future in what we're seeing, technology at the end use level.
Technology leapfrogging is something that, as you mentioned, is definitely happening. Especially you mentioned about Asia, but if you look at countries in Africa, I think they are going the next level. We had like meters where we had to take physical readings, but some part of Africa, they have like remote monitoring, remote meter reading and things like that. So as you said, even in the entire electricity value chain, you have innovations that are happening and everyone's going like 2 rungs above. So that is a good thing.
Exactly.
You did mention about storage. Storage is a big factor, both at the large scale and also at residential scale. And at both ends, US seems to be the market for all the major storage players. How did this come about?
Well, I think, if you look at the per capita consumption of electricity here, I would imagine it's in the, the top decile of, anyone globally. So I think it's just the sheer amount of demand is probably a big reason for that. Obviously, the ability to, the cost of these devices is more expensive, and so I suspect that median household income makes that bridge is probably easier to get to here. So
now going back to the deregulation point of view, deregulation has probably given more power to the consumers, and you as an entrepreneur, your main business runs around empowering consumers make better choices. So can you explain how do you do that?
Sure. Well, I think the most important thing to think about when we think about moving to a competitive market is, imagine going to the store and you're trying to buy meals for yourself. In the old store that you were used to, they had ramen. And that's all you wanted. You wanted to eat breakfast, lunch, or dinner. It was ramen, and you ate. And that's kind of the way the old world was for us. It was a tariff, and you got what you got, and that's exactly the way it was. Now imagine that the way competition works is you have a number of choices, and the folks that are supplying power now have the incentive to try to customize the types of products and services that you really need and structure these things in a way that fits more closely what works best for you. But they're doing this at the same time as they're trying to maximize their profits. So it's like you walk into the supermarket and you might have, the section with vegetables, and you've got, some of the folks who really want you to look at those carrots, and in other sections, you might have, the fish out there. And so how do you make a decision whether you want to have a vegetable meal or, fish meal? And so what happens is there's a lot of choices, and there's a much greater opportunity for there to be an optimization on behalf of the end user, whether that's a residential customer or it's a commercial customer.
Correct.
But at a certain point, it can become overwhelming. And so that's exactly what we're doing. We're here, and we're focused on, navigating through to really deliver the most optimal solutions for the customers that we represent based upon what their needs are. And some of them don't really fully understand how they use electricity. Some people just want someone else to come in and figure out what their situation is and just take care of it for them. And that's really what we're trying to do, is we're trying to increase the accessibility of being very efficient economically in this process while minimizing the amount of time, effort, and attention that the customer has to put into that process.
That's a good way to put it. And I am sure a lot of people do feel better when someone's there to guide them and kind of take the biggest burden out of their mind. And when you're showing real savings, then it's truly beneficial. That brings me to my next point. So, decentralized renewable energy adoption is also something that consumers prefer. Do you also enable them have access to that? Someone wants to put a solar rooftop on their plant and also procure power from the grid. So, do you also enable that kind of assessment and services?
Sure, 100%. We see that, and we have customers that are involved with that all the time. So not only do we have customers that come to us that already have pre-existing solar, we have others that want to go through the economics of making a solar installation, whether that makes sense for them. The community microgrid, because of the structure of the way the market is set up here, I'm not super familiar with a lot of places that have had a lot of traction on some of the community-based stuff other than joint ownership. Because usually, a microgrid is not going to be enough to serve the totality of the load, and you're still basically interconnected with the balance of the system, at least here. So there's not quite as much of that, but there's a tremendous amount of folks that have put solar systems in or other kinds of, battery backups. We have a lot of people here that have backup generators. Every time we have a hurricane that wipes out power infrastructure, then a lot of people end up, making investments in some of their behind the meter generation. So we see quite a bit of that, and we absolutely introduce and utilize that in the overall analysis of making decisions for our customers.
Making decisions for the customers is something that you enable, but I'm sure from the recent Texas grid crisis, and I have to ask you this question because a lot of consumers did kind of, especially consumers who preferred to have like variable tariff, missed the point and had like huge utility bills after the grid crisis. So what was it like for consumers who failed to switch or accept the price variation, and what was consumers' reaction during the grid crisis in Texas?
Yeah, so it's, so not that it wasn't a real problem. It was a real problem. I think that, we kind of live in a world now, at least here in the U.S., and unfortunately, I think it's something we're exporting everywhere else, where there's a media crisis du jour, and so it gets not to minimize all of that here, but it was I think it was a great story for a lot of the major media outlets here, and so I think it kind of it was made into something a little bit different than the reality might be, and the reason I said is the first question there. So there was a company here. There's actually two of them that were competitive resellers. So they were a retail electricity provider, and they had convinced a segment of their customer base that they were better off buying directly in what they called the wholesale market, which was not really the wholesale market. It's the basically the wholesale market of last resort. It's what happens when you're trying to balance supply and demand in the last 15 minutes of every operating hour.
Okay.
It's where about 5% of the energy trades. It's not the wholesale market, but that's the way it was billed. And so we had been warning folks for forever that the way the rules were structured in the market, that it's very likely that those people would get, it's only a matter of time until some kind of price explosion happened and whatever savings they thought they were achieving were going to be wiped out. And we'd been keeping track of this for years. Our customers that we've had in fixed price programs were consistently beating this index-based product that was out there. And I think there's so much ignorance in our consuming public here about the way electricity actually works, that they think, and it's very easy for people to think things like, well, if I go to the big box store, I can get a better deal if I buy it at wholesale, or I can get a better deal if I buy it in bulk. and electricity just doesn't work that way because you can't store it.
Correct.
And so no one can produce more. You can't produce more in bulk than is being used right now. So there's no such thing. It's just not possible. So the very good news about that is in Texas, there's about 10.5 million homes and businesses and meters, and a grand total of about 30,000 people were taking service under that structure. So it was a very, 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 very small number of people that got those outsized electricity bills. But they kind of, I don't think they had the imagination for how bad it could possibly be, but they kind of knew they were signing up for some volatility, right? So as it turns out, I'm not sure how many of those, some of those numbers got so large, $10, $20, $30,000 that I'm not sure that any of them paid those bills because that company did not pay its bills to the marketplace. So I suspect most people didn't actually end up paying that when it was all said and done. But people don't really pay attention here as well. There's definitely a failure of imagination on the part of the planning cycle here of how cold can it get. It was historically, unbelievably historically cold.
So there was definitely lessons for both the utility and the end consumer in this.
Right. Yeah. I think people don't really have a good sense of how cold and how anomalous that cold actually was here. It was, you talk about statistics and, how many sigma deviation was this? And I imagine it was probably like a 7 sigma deviation. It was colder here than it had been in 130 years. And so, yeah, it was absolutely, if you think about it, if I'm building a wind plant that has a expected 25-year economic useful life, does it make sense for me to increase the cost of that installation by 10% at the time of installation to cover off a weather scenario that occurs maybe once every 75 years? And so, I think it was an economic decision that those companies made, and there's, consequences associated with that. So
that's fair. Jesson, on a final note, since you're dealing with consumers and since you have a background about utilities, and we spoke about how utility transformation is happening around the world, what in your opinion, because we generally, when we talk about utilities and electricity being like a basic necessity to ensure equity in energy access, at the same time, decarbonization is happening, how can utilities ensure there is equity in energy access at the same time having decarbonization projects going on and ensuring that the vulnerable is not impacted in the process?
Well, that's an excellent question, and it's an excellent point. And I think that's probably you're trying to solve for a number of these challenging variables that work against one another, right? So decarbonization Correct. By itself, and then access and equitable access. Those are in some ways, the net effects of those things can be somewhat diametrically opposed. Only because the cost of decarbonization right now at the state of technology is more expensive, and it's less reliable. And so that's just a reality of what we're seeing, at least in my context of the overall end-to-end solutions that I see in North America. But I think, as we talked about earlier, I'm extremely hopeful because I believe that this is it's a technology opportunity, and this is the place where technology and increases in innovation are going to lead the way to make that a reality. In the end, what I think should happen, and we may not have enough land for the geography required for the current kinds of renewable technologies. I don't know if we have I guess we could cover the Sahara Desert in solar and whatnot. But if you assume that we have no constraint, there's not a geographical problem with building renewable projects. In the end, I think that if technology advances the renewable technology should win on economic.
Fair.
And so that's a good news scenario, because now you're not worried about the people that say, oh, well, climate change is not real or carbon dioxide emissions are irrelevant. You don't have to convince anyone one way or the other. You just win on economics. The reason that renewable technologies, in my opinion, should win, if we can figure out how to store them and we can figure out how to, reduce the cost to manufacture and make those manufacturing processes far more environmentally friendly with the renewable technologies. If we can do that, we should beat the traditional coal, gas, oil-fired generation, because our fuel is free. It's a huge difference. If you don't have a variable cost to produce, and it's all about the capital invested in building and storing, and if we get a huge economy of scale and a reduction in cost, and we get a reduction in the economic or the environmental impacts associated with building these renewable generators and that infrastructure, I think that's what wins. I think that's how you get to having far more widespread access, equitable distribution of the availability of energy, and at the same time, moving towards decarbonization goals that I think just happen because it's a superior way to do it. And so I think if I had to place all my chips and where I would want to bet on that becoming a reality, is it's going to be technological innovation that allows that to occur. And that's what's so exciting, because I don't think there's any one part of the world that has a hammerlock on these kinds of solutions. I really don't. I think that, in fact, a lot of parts of the world that are dealing and grappling with these issues much more closely, they're far more near and dear to the hearts of those communities. And I think you're going to have much greater effort in finding solutions to those things. So I personally am looking to the rest of the world, to help us figure out how to do some of these things. This is definitely a place where I think we're going to be able to learn from other smart people doing amazing things.
That's wonderfully put. Technology innovation is going to be key to ensure that we have wins across all categories, be it decarbonization or ensuring energy access and making sure it's equitable. So that's a fantastic note to end the conversation on, Jesson. It was a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you for taking time to join me on the show today.
Of course. I really enjoyed it, and I hope I didn't put any of your listeners to sleep.
Well, that was a wrap on the conversation with Jesson. Hope you found it interesting. 3 key takeaways for me from the conversation was the impact of opening up of electricity markets for retail competition post deregulation in the US, and what's the impact it's had on consumers. Number 2 was how technology and innovation can actually help developing countries leapfrog in the energy transition, especially at the consumer level. And finally, it was interesting to know the story behind Texas electricity grid crisis of 2021. The links to connect with Jesson will be there in the show notes section of the episode as usual, so please check them. And finally, like always, do join me in helping spread the message to a wider audience. The simplest way to do that is to share the podcast link to at least 3 people in your network. It could take 30 seconds or less. Or there is another way you can help me, which is to write a review on Apple Podcast or any platform that you use. It definitely helps in the show's global discoverability. With that, I will be back in 2 weeks' time. Signing off, this is Girish Shivakumar, and as always, thank you for listening.